She scanned him twice. Every reading said, dead. He said, not yet. HFY Sci-Fi drama. The battlefield was soaked in plasma and smoke when she found him face down. Unmoving, burned across half his body. Heart monitors flatlined. No pulse, no breath. By all her training, by all alien medicine, this human was dead. But when she touched his shoulder to say goodbye, his fingers twitched and his cracked lips whispered something that made her blood freeze. Not yet. And in that moment, she realized they didn't understand humans at all, not their pain threshold, not their madness, not their will to survive, because what crawled out of that crater wasn't just a soldier, it was something far more terrifying. Man who refused to die until his mission was done. The last blast had shattered the ridge and sent fire raining down like a storm of death, and the medics had given up, even before they reached the crater, because no one could survive that much heat that close to an orbital strike. But Dr. Jirali moved anyway, stepping over rubble and burned metal with trembling hands, and her scanner trembling just as much as her voice as she whispered his name again and again. But the only answer was silence and the smell of scorched human flesh and broken armor, until finally she reached him, his body half buried under the collapsed hull of a walker, his arm twisted wrong, his chest plate melted into his skin, and when she finally knelt beside him, she hesitated even as the scanner beeped to life, because she already knew what it would say. No heartbeat, no brainwave, no blood pressure. Just red flatline across all vitals, and her breath caught because she didn't want to believe it. Not him, not the one who had dragged 3 of her crew out of fire, not the one who stood between her and the Kordax blade back on Riloth, not the one who kept saying they'd all go home even when their escape ship was scrap and their base overrun. But now she was looking at him, and the scanner didn't lie. He was dead clinically, medically, completely, and she whispered a shaky goodbye in her language, one used for soldiers fallen in war, and reached for his dog tags to send back to Earth. And the second her fingers touched his collarbone, his eyes snapped open, and she screamed, not because she was scared, but because what she saw in his eyes was not life, not pain, not even confusion, but something deeper, something primal, something ancient, like death had come and left him alone because it couldn't take him yet. And his voice was gravel and blood as he rasped 2 words through lips cracked with heat and soot. Not yet. And Jiraile's scanner dropped from her hand as she backed away on instinct, watching him move, fingers twitching first, then his arm bracing against the wreckage, then groaning as he pushed himself up, and she yelled for help, but no one came, because no one believed he could still be breathing, and she watched as he stood, blood pouring from his side like a fountain, his knee bent wrong, his eye burned shut, but he stood like a statue built from fury and something more unholy, and she grabbed his arm, tried to stop him from collapsing again, but he looked at her and said, "No, you have to live, get to the others." And she realized then he wasn't alive for himself, he was alive for them, for her, for all the people who still needed someone to buy them another minute to escape. And she screamed into her cum that he was alive, and the medics laughed until she showed the scanner readings, until she told them he was walking again, and one of them whispered a prayer, because humans weren't supposed to do that, weren't supposed to rise from death like that. And the Kordax were circling again, their flyers screaming across the dust sky, and the plasma shots returned, and she was pulled back by a soldier who yelled that they had to move. But she kept looking back at him, at the human who should be dead, who said not yet, and was still walking straight toward the enemy line, holding nothing but a broken blade and a half-charged plasma cell. And as the others pulled her away, she realized that everything she thought she knew about endurance, about biology, about limits, had just been rewritten by a man with 1 lung and no heartbeat, who refused to stop until the last of his people were safe. and she whispered his name over and over, not in fear, not in mourning, but in awe, because this was no longer about survival. This was about something else, something more like defiance, like hope, like vengeance, walking on two broken legs and a will no god could bend, and she didn't know if he would live another minute or fall with the next breath. But she knew this with every beat of her alien heart, he would not die here, not until he chose to, not until the mission was done, and that scared her more than any enemy ever had. Gerali couldn't breathe as the roar of engines filled the sky above them, and the smoke turned gold with heat shimmer from the enemy drop crafts that had begun descending, again in slow, steady waves like a tide of death rolling forward, and she kept looking back even as the others pulled her toward the makeshift evac trench dug into the edge of the ruined command ridge, and all around her were wounded soldiers, some human, some alien, all huddled behind scraps of cover and barely clinging to life, but none of them could look away from the same thing, because he was still moving, the man they called Bishop, the Terran sergeant who had taken a direct orbital lance and lived, whose armor was melted into his chest and whose every step left a blood print on the dust, and no one spoke because there were no words for what they were seeing. And when he reached the fallen Kordak scout skimmer and pulled the pulse rifle from its shredded corpse with fingers stiff from nerve damage, everyone stared, even the dying, even the ones praying for a clean end, because what they were watching was not a man surviving, it was a man resurrecting. And Gerali wiped soot from her eyes and screamed into the evac, come for someone to come down, for him to send another drone to pick him up. But the voice on the other end just said negative. We read him as deceased, and she almost smashed the device in rage. But then Bishop raised the rifle and let out a sound that wasn't a war cry and wasn't a scream, but something in between, something raw that echoed off every broken wall like a ghost's fury returned to finish its business. And then he ran, or maybe it was more like falling forward so fast the ground had no time to hold him down, and he hit the Kordax line alone, just one man bleeding and coughing and missing chunks of himself. But with every shot from the alien rifle, another enemy dropped, and their shrieks changed from triumph to confusion to fear, and still he kept going, firing and swinging and grabbing weapons from the dead and turning them into tools of vengeance, and it made no sense. Gerali knew it couldn't be real because no human had that much blood to lose and still move, and the reading still said flatline, and her hands were shaking as she scanned him again from behind cover, and the data made less sense than before. His heart was in cardiac arrest, and his brain waves were spiking like a storm, and his core temperature was falling like death had claimed him. But his muscles moved anyway, and her fingers gripped the dirt as the smoke turned red, and the screams rose because the Kordax were panicking now and firing wildly. And the humans behind her, some barely conscious, some half buried, began crawling toward the sound, not to run, not to escape, but to follow him. And Gerali felt something rising in her chest. Not fear, not grief, but awe, because Bishop wasn't just refusing to die, he was pulling others back from the edge just by standing. And when he took a hit to the side that should have severed his spine, he dropped to one knee for barely a second, then stood again and kept going. And when his rifle jammed, he didn't stop, he threw it into the face of the next alien and grabbed a blade glowing with blue toxin and shoved it through the chest of a Kordax warrior that stood twice his size, and the whole line broke, because the Kordax had never seen this before, had never fought something that should be dead, and wasn't and wouldn't be until it chose. And the evac siren finally blared, and Gerali looked up to see the med drone dive from the clouds fast and wild, and far too late, because he was already past the line now, deep in their back ranks and carving a path through armor and scale with nothing but rage and broken bones. And she jumped up, before she could think, and ran into the smoke toward him, screaming his name as the others yelled for her to stop, but she didn't because she knew something they didn't, that he wouldn't come back, not unless someone pulled him out, that he would burn himself into ash if it meant one more person lived. And when she found him, he was on his knees in a puddle of blood and alien oil, and his blade was buried in the ground beside a pile of corpses, and his hand was shaking, and his eyes were blank, like he was somewhere else, and her breath hitched as she dropped beside him, calling his name and shaking his shoulder, and for a second she thought she was too late, until his fingers curled around hers, and he whispered again, "Not yet," and she sobbed because it wasn't just a phrase, it was a promise. And then she yelled into the cum that she had him, that he was still breathing, even if the scanner said otherwise, and this time they didn't argue this time. The drone dropped right above them, and two claws reached down, and she held on to him as they were lifted skyward out of fire and ruin, and her blood dripped onto his face. And she didn't know whose it was anymore, and she didn't care because he was alive. And she wasn't going to let that flame go out, not after what she had seen, not after what he had done, not after the battlefield itself had whispered the same truth in every language, across every race, that sometimes death doesn't win, not because of magic or science, but because someone refuses to let it. The med bay smelled like burned wires and antiseptic and old blood, and it buzzed with the sound of broken machines and people groaning behind curtains, and over all of it was the slow beep of monitors, barely keeping the wounded alive, but none of them were as broken as him. None of them looked like they should be in a body bag, except they weren't, because he wasn't, and Jireli sat beside him, refusing to leave, even when the nurses tried to move her, even when the xenodoctors warned her he might not come back, that his brain was damaged, that his nerves were gone, that his body was in irreversible trauma. And she screamed at them to shut up, because he had already proven them wrong once, and he would do it again, and they didn't understand, because they hadn't seen him rise from a blast crater, and they hadn't seen him tear through enemy lines with nothing but fury in his hands, and they hadn't seen him whisper, "Not yet," while dying, and still move like death had lost its grip. And the nurses stared at her like she was the one losing her mind, but she didn't care, because his fingers were twitching again and again, and she counted every time and made a log of it. And when she scanned him for the 10th time that day, the machine still said 0 vitals and no brainwave, but his hand gripped hers so tightly she cried, and that was life. That was enough for her. And she stayed with him through the long cold nights, when the station lights flickered and the enemy was still hunting them in the dark, and the screams of soldiers dying in other wards echoed down the halls, and every medic looked like they were running on the edge of collapse. But still she stayed still. She whispered to him about what was happening outside, about the soldiers who had survived because of him, about the little girl they found under the rubble, who said the last thing she saw before the collapse was him standing over her with his arms wide, blocking the fire with his own body, and how she kept a melted piece of his armor like a relic and called it her shield. And she told him about the engineers who stopped sleeping just to print new battle reports with his name etched on every rescue log. And she didn't know if he could hear her, but sometimes his breathing changed, and sometimes his lips moved just a little, and when she cried, it was not from sadness but from hope. And even when the doctors finally said he would never wake up, she didn't believe them, because she knew better. And one night, as the stars flickered outside the station, and the cold crept through the vents, and the war outside grew louder and comes, she heard a sound, and at first she thought it was the wind or her own thoughts, but then it came again, a whisper, broken and hoarse, and she leaned close to his mouth and heard it clear and real and impossible. "Not yet," and she screamed so loud the whole wing came running, and the chief medic scanned him and the monitor that had been blank for days beeped once, then again and again, and then it screamed to life with a pulse slow and erratic, but real, and every nurse in the room stared like they were seeing a ghost, except he wasn't a ghost. He was a soldier, and he was waking up, and his eyes opened slowly like every movement hurt, but when they locked on hers he smiled. Just a little, and she dropped to her knees beside his bed and covered her mouth, because she didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream or pray, and the doctors rushed in and shoved her back and pumped him with stabilizers and pressed pads against his chest and kept shouting vital stabilizing and neuro return detected and synapse recovery at 5%, and it was like watching a star reignite after dying. And when he finally whispered her name, she collapsed into his side and held his face and told him everything all at once, and he smiled again before drifting back to sleep. And from that moment forward, no one called him just human. No one doubted what he was, because every race on the station knew the stories. Now the ones who saw the footage of his charge, the ones who saw the enemy lines break from fear, the ones who knew the Kordax had ordered a retreat just from one man standing and bleeding, and now that man was alive again, and no one understood it. Not the doctors, not the machines, not even the war priests who said he had come back, because a soul like his didn't obey the rules of gods or graves. And Jirali sat beside him every day, now documenting everything, watching the world change around them. Because his survival had shifted the tide, entire units rallied under his name. Rebel factions laid down arms just from hearing he was alive, and planets that had once surrendered to fear began to resist again, because hope had a face, and it was his. And she saw how he blinked more every hour, how he asked for water, how his voice got clearer, and every time she heard it, she had to hold back tears, because she was watching a miracle unfold one breath at a time, and she would never leave, not until he could walk again, not until he could see what he had done, what he had become. And when he asked her why she stayed, she told him the truth, that he was the reason. She didn't give up, that he taught her what humans really were, not just flesh, not just war, not just stubborn, but something else. Something defiant and brilliant and terrifying to anything that tried to break them. And when he laughed weakly and whispered, "Guess I'm harder to kill than they thought," she laughed, too, because death had come and failed, and now it would never take him without a fight. The news of his awakening spread like wildfire through the station, through the fleet, through the scattered resistance cells hiding in the shadow zones, and through the broken empires watching the war from dark corners. And it didn't take long before his name, Bishop, turned into something more than a soldier, more than a man. It became a symbol, and symbols were dangerous because they gave people something to believe in, and that was something the Kordax couldn't allow. And while Jirali stayed by his side, helping him sit up, feeding him slow drops of water, keeping his muscles from locking with gentle hands and whispered words, the war outside was changing, shifting violently, because now the enemy was afraid. Now they were reacting. Instead of controlling, and deep in the command vaults of the Kordax high minds, orders were given to find him, to end him permanently and quietly, before he could rise again, before he could walk again, before he could speak in public, and set the stars on fire with hope. But inside the station he was still recovering, his body wrecked, but fighting piece by piece, each tendon, each bone healing slower than normal, but healing because the doctors had finally stopped treating him like a ghost and started calling him what he was, a survivor. And they asked him questions, ran tests, scanned his nerves, and every answer confused them more, because he still had no proper heartbeat, still had brainwave patterns unlike any species known, still had organ responses that flickered in and out like someone halfway through the veil. And yet he lived and spoke and stared with eyes so steady it made even the surgeons uncomfortable. And Gerali knew something the others didn't, that his will was stronger than any medicine. That what kept him alive was not just the science, but something deeper, something like a fire that refused to go out. And she stayed every night curling up in the seat beside his bed, telling him stories of her home, her people, her dreams, and sometimes he'd smile and whisper one back about Earth, about oceans and storms, and a dog he once had who never stopped barking. And every moment like that made her feel like the war was far away, like the pain was a different life, but it always came back, always crashed in again, like the day the explosion rocked the station, and red lights screamed down the halls, and the coms cut to static, and soldiers ran past with drawn weapons, and she grabbed Bishop's arm, not in fear but in reflex, because she wouldn't leave him, and he tried to sit up too fast and fell back with a grunt. But his hands reached for her, like he was ready to protect her even now, and that was when she knew the Kordax had come for him, and the med ward turned into a fortress with soldiers dragging cabinets to block the doors, and the nurses handing out rifles, and the chief medic yelling to secure the patient, and Bishop just breathing slower, like he was waiting, and outside the sounds of plasma blasts echoed closer and closer, and someone yelled breach, and the door split open with a hiss, and the first Kordax warrior stepped inside, covered in black armor with glowing red veins and blades on both arms, and Gerali stood in front of the bed even as her hands shook, and the Kordax raised a weapon, and everything went slow, and Bishop was already moving even though his muscles screamed and his chest burned. He rolled off the bed with a roar that silenced the whole room, and tackled the alien to the ground, stealing the blade and driving it into the enemy's throat before anyone else could react, and everyone stared as he stood, bare-chested, covered in blood, in nothing but medical wraps, and the monitors screamed again as his vitals dropped to zero, but he didn't fall, and Gerali grabbed a weapon and covered him, and the soldiers rallied, and the hallway turned into chaos, and Bishop moved like death reborn, not fast, not smooth, but like a storm of intent breaking bone and armor, until the Kordax retreated, and the doors were sealed, and silence returned, except for the beeping of machines that couldn't explain him. And Bishop collapsed into Gerali's arms and whispered, "Sorry, couldn't let you die," and she held him close and whispered, "You idiot, you beautiful, terrifying idiot," and cried against his neck, because this was no longer just survival, this was war turning around because of one man, one impossible man, and the command center demanded he be moved to secure location, and he said no, not without her, and they agreed. Because what else could they do when the troops in every sector had already started drawing his mark on their armor, and the word "not yet" had become a war cry, echoing from one battlefield to another, and every time someone wanted to give up, they whispered it, and kept fighting, and even the enemy had begun to fear it, because they didn't understand how something could be so broken and still rise. And as Bishop was transferred to the core of the station with Gerali at his side, she looked at him and asked, "What are you?" And he smiled just a little and said, "I'm just a man." And she shook her head, because he wasn't just a man, he was the end of fear. And as the doors sealed behind them and guards moved into formation, and the medtechs ran new scans that would again show he was medically dead, she knew that death would not claim him, not here, not now, not ever, because his will was louder than silence and stronger than pain, and because this war wasn't over and he wasn't done. The galaxy had never been quiet, not since the war began, not since the Kordax spread across the stars like a plague and crushed world after world with no mercy. But now there was a strange silence, an unnatural pause, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting and watching and listening, because the story of the human who died and stood up anyway had become more than rumor, it had become legend and legends. moved faster than light across pirate channels, and resistance comes, and even through the encrypted networks of neutral colonies who swore they wanted no part in the war. And his name Bishop echoed in every mouth and every soldier whispered not yet before charging into fire, and now the high command of the last United Alliance called for him, summoned him not as a patient, but as a symbol, and Bishop stood in front of them, still limping, still scarred, wrapped in bandages, with a body held together by stubbornness and painkillers, and Jirali by his side like always, her hand near his back, not because he needed her to hold him up, but because she refused to let him stand alone. And the generals looked at him with wide eyes, some with awe, some with doubt, and some with fear, because they had seen the footage, they had heard the screams, they had seen the readings from his body, and none of it made sense, none of it could be explained, and that terrified them more than anything. And when they asked him what he wanted, he said only one thing: to end this war, and they didn't know whether to call it madness or prophecy, because the man in front of them had no army, no fleet, no rank, just a fire in his eyes that would not die. And one general leaned forward and asked, "Are you even human anymore?" And Bishop just smiled and said, "Human enough." And that was when Jirali stepped forward and spoke, not like a doctor, not like an alien, but like someone who had watched death lose. She said, "You may not believe what he is, but I have seen what he does, and what he does is make the impossible happen." And the room fell silent, because they could feel it too, that shift in the air, that weight that came with someone who had already crossed the line between life and death and come back with purpose. And the Alliance had no choice. They gave him what he asked for: a squad, a ship, a route into the deepest part of enemy space, because he had a plan, and the plan was madness. Sneak into the core hive of the Kordax, reach the mind root, the place that linked every hive soldier to the command wheel, and break it, not with bombs, not with virus code, but with something far worse, with him. And Jirali stood with him as they entered the warship, the fastest vessel left, the only one fast enough to cut through the lines. And when it lifted from the docking ring, everyone on the station stood still, watching the screens, watching the man who should be dead fly toward the heart of the enemy with no fear. And she watched him as he stood at the helm, staring into the stars, not blinking, not shaking. And she asked him why he wasn't afraid, and he said, "Because I already died once, and this time I'm taking something with me." And her heart ached, not from fear, but from love, because she knew what he meant, that he didn't care about surviving again, only about finishing what he started. And as they neared the edge of Kordax space, the ship shook from the tension of what lay ahead, and the crew, many of them volunteers, many of them survivors of battles where Bishop had turned the tide, stood straighter just from being near him. And one of them whispered, "I'd follow him into hell." And Jirali whispered back, "We are." And the moment came, the dark gate opened, and enemy signals screamed across the scanners, and every soldier gripped their rifles tighter. And Bishop stepped to the drop ramp, his body wrapped in black armor, half tech, half scrap, half patched from 5 different species, and glowing faintly with something not even Jirali could explain. And before the ramp dropped, she touched his shoulder and asked one last time, "Are you sure?" And he looked at her, not with fire, but with something softer, and said, "I have to be, because if I don't do this, no one will." And then the light turned green, and the doors blew open, and the storm began, and Bishop dropped like a meteor into the core of the Kordax Empire, with only his squad behind him, and nothing else. And what followed was not a battle, but a reckoning, because the Kordax had feared this moment, and tried to stop it with ships, with weapons, with entire legions. But none of it mattered, because every time he fell he rose, and every time they surrounded him, they died. And every time the scanners tried to declare him dead, the ground trembled. Instead, and even the hive minds began to scream not in words, but in fear, because the pulse they felt from him was not human, not alien, not machine, but something raw, something that made the old gods flinch. And deep inside the ship, Gerali listened to the feed as his heartbeat pulsed through the walls, not in numbers, not in lines, but in that one phrase over and over, not yet, not yet, not yet, like a drumbeat against the end of the world. And she held her breath, because she knew this was the final storm, and either the galaxy would burn or he would walk out of the fire one last time. The core of the Kordax hive was alive and wrong, with walls that pulsed like muscle in air, that tasted like poison, and machines that whispered and screamed at the same time. Bishop moved through it like a shadow of war, each step echoing through chambers filled with nightmares, each breath heavy with the stink of death and memory. And he was alone now, because the squad that followed him had stayed behind to hold the last gate, to keep the reinforcements from cutting him off, and Gerali had been forced to remain on the ship under protest, locked down by the command AI. After she tried to join him in the final descent, and she paced the command deck, with her hands clenched into fists, listening to his vitals. Still broken, still unreadable. Still screaming flatline, even as his audio feed whispered the sounds of footsteps, blades drawn, blasters heating up, and Bishop breathing slow like a storm about to break. And the closer he got to the mind root, the louder the voices became, not words, not language, but pressure, like something ancient, something hive-born and hungry, reaching for his mind to twist it, to crush it, to turn him into a puppet like the millions before him. But they couldn't reach him. They couldn't crack the wall of rage and pain and love that kept him upright and walking. And when he reached the final chamber, he found it not empty, not guarded, but waiting, filled with Kordax elders, their bodies long and covered in glowing marks, their heads bowed in minds linked, and in the center, a construct of light and shadow, the mind root, the source of command, the thing that controlled the hive with thought and fear and calculation. And as he stepped forward, the elders opened their eyes, and one spoke in a voice that echoed inside his skull, saying, "You should not be." And Bishop answered with the last words anyone ever heard from him. He said, "Not yet." And then the room exploded into fire and light and movement. And no one knows exactly what happened next, because the feed went black and the scanners died and the signal burst into static. But everyone remembers what came after, because the mind root shattered, not with an explosion, but with silence that spread like a pulse through every Kordax soldier, every ship, every drone. And one by one they stopped moving like statues caught mid-scream, and across the galaxy battlefields froze as enemy weapons dropped from twitching claws, and ships drifted without pilots, and the war stopped like the whole galaxy blinked and forgot how to breathe. And on the ship, Virali fell to her knees as the silence hit, and she screamed for answers, screamed into the coms, screamed his name until her voice broke, but there was no answer, no sign of life, only stillness. And for a long time, no one knew if he had survived, only that the Kordax were broken and retreating and dying, like their purpose had been cut from them, like their thoughts were shattered. And the Alliance called it a miracle, and the High Command declared victory, and statues were built, and planets freed, and children named after him. But Gerali didn't care about any of that, because she searched the ruins herself, boarded the dropship against orders with her own hands, and climbed through the shattered hive and the corpses and the smoke until she reached the place where the root had been. And there in the center of it all was his armor, cracked and empty, and a smear of blood that glowed faintly like fire. And she fell to her knees and held the pieces close and whispered, "You said not yet." And the medics tried to pull her back, and she screamed until they left her alone. And days passed and the fleet moved on, but she stayed, and no one stopped her, because They knew what he meant to her and what he meant to them all. And on the 9th night when the moons aligned and the stars blinked like old eyes, she felt something stir in the ashes, and a hand reached up through the dust and gripped her wrist, and she turned and saw him barely breathing, broken in ways she couldn't count but alive, and she held him and cried and whispered, "You idiot, I thought you were gone." And he smiled, just a little, and said, "I told you not yet." And the galaxy turned again. Not in fear, not in war, but in hope, because the man who died and walked still lived, and the stars remembered and whispered his name, like a promise that as long as humans like him existed, the darkness would never win. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY Sci-Fi stories that prove it.